Welcome to session 7 of Understanding Human Evil. This one is titled Ideological Evil, and it's a follow-on from session 6. When we talked about ideological evil in session 6, we looked at it from the point of view of understanding ideology as being something which human beings need in order to function in the world. It's a system of belief by which we interpret our own experiences of life and develop a code or guide for how we should live, what values we have, and what kinds of behavior we accept and what kind of behaviors we don't accept. So when it comes to human evil, it's a very important concept. Ideological evil is perhaps one of the most driving forces of most of the evil in the world. And we have seen in our session on banality of evil that evildoers are oftentimes evil is carried out by people who don't intend to do evil. But in order to do that, they are usually following an ideological precept. Now, they may not be true believers in the ideology, they may be simply the foot soldiers. So now we have essentially we have the guts of a way of understanding collective evil that is carried out by groups, oftentimes within a political or religious framework. So I want to start off with something here, a speech given by Heinrich Himmler to the soldiers, the Einsatzgruppen in Posen. Himmler was kind of a mystical kind of a fellow with quasi half-baked religious ideas, and an intelligent man. Like most of the Nazis were actually quite intelligent. The SS had more university graduates than the general population. But in order to impress Himmler with the effectiveness of the work that they were doing in the East, he was invited to visit the Einsatzgruppen, and they wanted to put a show on for him, which they did. They had trenches dug, they had the people there, which they slaughtered. And he had his greatcoat on him, and at one stage, and he got quite sickened by the experience. It was not a good experience for Himmler. He got some brain matter splashed on his greatcoat, and observers at the time said he kind of turned very pale and nauseous. So this gave him pause for thought, because he felt that this was very difficult. And in the speech afterwards, he said to the soldiers, he said, "Most of you know what it means to see 100 corpses piled up, or 500 or 1,000. He said, to have gone through this, and except for instances of human weakness, to have remained decent. That is what made us tough. This is an unwritten and never to be written glorious page in our history." Unquote. And further on then in the speech, he said, "We had the moral right, we had the duty towards our people to destroy this people that had wanted to destroy us. But we do not have the right to enrich ourselves by so much as a fur, as a watch, by one mark or a cigarette or anything else. We do not want in the end to be destroyed by this bacillus and to die. I will never stand by and watch while even a small rotten spot develops or takes hold. Wherever it may form, we will burn it away. All in all, however, we can say that we have carried out this most difficult of tasks in the spirit of love for our people, and we have suffered no harm to our inner being, or soul, or character." So when we think about ideological evil, I'm using this speech to help us to understand what happens to a human being who is captured by what I'm calling a pernicious ideology, and that is an ideological system that leads them to murder people. And again, Hannah Arendt is very, very helpful here, because I'm basing a lot of this on her work, but we'll also integrate some psychology into this. Because you see, when we think about people's vulnerability to ideology, we're left with a situation where we must say, well, what is the ideology doing? How is it manifesting itself in your life? So I'm going to change this into the second person, your life and my life, if we are all susceptible to ideology, how do we make the distinction between ideological positions that are pernicious, that are evil, that are encouraging us to do evil? And how does that work? Because I think it's not simply a logical piece. It's not. Now, Arendt, as you would have heard in session one of this piece, would have been telling us that it is the logic is what traps us. Once we've accepted in the murderer's alphabet, once we have accepted a certain premise, then very, very easily the logic of that premise can lead us down into doing evil and harming people. So why was it so powerful? What was it that what did the ideology offer these people that they could reverse any form of humane understanding? You see, Himmler was, and this is an important piece too as well, because Himmler speech at Posen grew out of his empathy, but his empathy was for the soldiers. His empathy was for the people who were doing this really difficult work. And it sped up his enthusiasm for the gas chambers, because he was thinking, we've got to do this in a better way. This is very, very hard. This is very hard on people. These soldiers are, we have to give them a lot of drink. We have to encourage them. We have to do all this stuff because, we can't be doing this. We have to find an easier way. So this was part and parcel of the motivation to get the gas chambers up and running quickly, which would mean that it would be less taxing on the soldiers. Now, I know as I'm saying this, I'm doing this, tongue in cheek is not the right way of expressing it, but with a certain normality. I do not want you to think that I think this is normal behavior in the sense that it's horrific. But what I am saying is that empathy, and we'll see this in our session on how do we combat evil, empathy is over exaggerated and overestimated in its capacity for preventing evil doing, because Himmler had the capacity for empathy. In fact, he was considered to be very empathic. He used to one I don't know whether it's true or not, but one comment I've heard is that he used to sneak in the back door of his house because he didn't want to frighten or to disturb his budgie. So when he felt that the budgie needed to rest, he didn't want to disturb him. Anyway, let's go back to why it is so powerful. Hannah Arendt tells us that in Germany at the time, one of the reasons why they were so susceptible to the fascist ideology, and the reason I'm bringing this up here is because there are so many parallels going on today. She said that it gave the ideological tenets were accepted because they gave the masses of atomized, undefinable, unstable, and futile individuals a means of self-definition and identification, which not only restored some of the self-respect that they had formerly derived from their functioning in society, but it also created a kind of spurious stability which made them better candidates for an organization. So the fascist ideology was very appealing to people because they were quite broken at that point socially. And in the fragmentation of society that happened in the interwar years in post-Weimar Germany, people were reaching out for a system that gave them some kind of meaning. And the fascist ideology of the Nazi regime was very attractive. I bring that up here because it's important when we're looking at ideology to think, how has it landed in the human consciousness? What conditions make people more susceptible to it? Okay, so how does it get converted? How does the ideology then convert into the person actually doing evil doing? So first piece is they're susceptible to it. The second thing is that it's extremely ideological, rational. It gives them something to hope for, but it also, once they've accepted it, there is a logical piece that they will follow on. And the other piece of all of this that Arendt talks about is she talks about the idea of this, she calls them recipes of an ideology. The two big ideologies of the 19th century that were at work that created massive levels of evil were fascism and communism. Now, people will argue that capitalism and Western, what we're seeing now, unregulated capitalism, can lead to the same type of situation, and there's great deal of validity in that. But the microscope that fascism and communism have come under help us to understand more clearly that these are two ideological positions that are vastly different in some aspects, but they both led to the same kind of outcome, which was millions of innocent people dying. The reason for that is because ideological positions can contain different clauses or dogmas or doctrines. So the fascist recipe and then the communist recipe are quite different, but they both required evil doing at a vast scale because they both required the destruction of people who would not accept it. And this is one of the key pieces of a pernicious ideology, is that it creates an in-group and an out-group. The pernicious ideology functions on the idea that the human being who's accepted an ideology has accepted that this ideology has something very special. It has given them some grip on truth. And this is why truth is an important piece here. And that those who do not accept it are in some way either subhuman or are an enemy because they threaten the ideology. So it creates an enemy. So ideological positions that create an enemy will obviously then you have to deal with how do you deal with that enemy, because you've got to protect the ideology. Why do you have to protect an ideology? You protect the ideology because you're emotionally and spiritually and psychologically identifying with it. And if somebody threatens that, you become ideologically threatened. Your sense of identity becomes under threat. So in order for ideology to stick, to a pernicious ideology to stick, you've got to convince the person, and the person not just is convinced intellectually, but emotionally embraces this. This is the truth. But the difficulty is that most of the time, these types of ideology are actually what Arendt calls emancipated from reality. They're actually unreal. There's parts of them that just don't fit. She says ideological thinking becomes emancipated from the reality we perceive with our five senses and insists on a truer reality concealed behind all perceptible things, dominating them from a place of concealment and requiring a sixth sense that enables us to become aware of it. The sixth sense is precisely the ideology, that particular ideological indoctrination which is taught by the educational institutions established exclusively for this purpose to train the political soldiers in the Ordenburgen of the Nazis, or the Comintern of the common form. So the sixth sense, this is very important, and also Immanuel Kant uses this idea of the sixth sense, that you get a super sense. A person who has engaged with the ideology has now found a truth that is not open to other people unless they join in, unless they become part of that. All cults, for example, are clearly built on the notion that a cult member has a grip on reality and a grip on the truth that other people do not have. The difference with a pernicious ideology is there's a clause that's put in there, which is that we will not accept the existence of people who do not follow our ideological piece. That's the pernicious to kill, the permission to kill. And so she also calls this the separation from reality, that people who engage in this, why do they do that? And she says, before the alternative of facing the anarchic growth and total arbitrariness of decay, or bowing down before the most rigid, fantastically fictitious consistency of an ideology, the masses probably always choose the latter and are ready to pay for it with individual sacrifices. And this is not because they are stupid or wicked, but because in the general disaster, this escape grants them a minimum of self-respect. So the attraction to this is that you don't have to face the arbitrariness, the absurdities, the chaos. And as a society descends further into chaos, which we are appearing in the 21st century, unexpectedly, a great deal of the developed world is actually heading towards the cliff, and people are frightened. And we have seen this. I'm not going to talk specifically about particular politicians or particular countries, but I am going to talk about understanding that the more vulnerable people become, the more frightened they become, the more distressed they become, the more easily they are to lead themselves and to choose ideological positions that are actually emancipated from reality, and that have a logic in them that will lead people to evil doing. Another part of those forms of ideology is that it's always future orientated. So while the ideology is currently landing in the psyche, the outcome is always somewhere in the future. There's somewhere a great future somewhere, and we will sacrifice what we need to sacrifice today for this utopian future. And in general, that future is hell. Karl Popper says, those who thought that most people who think that they will create heaven on earth will actually create hell. Okay, so we've got the concept now of the recipes of ideology. Ideological positions don't have to be similar; they can be quite different, but they have this similar strand, which is they create an enemy. Once you create an enemy, once you create an infidel, once you create an undermention, or once you create an ethnic group that you consider to be inferior or to be a threat, then you have a doctrine in your ideology whereby it now becomes rational and logical to try to get rid of them. And you either get rid of them by that they will actually be tormented into a position where they become obedient and they follow suit or they join, or they are incarcerated, which is what happened with the Jews initially, and then eventually they can be killed. So if you look at something very simple like the Rwandan massacre, the Hutus and the Tutsis, for a year before the massacre of 900,000, and I think I mentioned this in one of the other sessions, that the Hutus managed to kill more people in 6 weeks than the Nazis with all their industrialized murder machine were able to do. They did it with machetes and clubs. But for a whole year beforehand, the radio, and Goebbels was the one who, put the radio on the map in terms of indoctrination. But seemingly in Rwanda, for almost a whole year, the cultivation of fear among the Hutus about the Tutsis, and hate and rage, and the constant denoting them as cockroaches and lice, just a carbon copy of what Goebbels did with Jews, just tips over. It just tips over, and then one day it started. 6 weeks later, 900,000 innocent people were dead in the most horrific circumstances. So you see how ideology, an ideological position, once it lands in the human psyche. Now, what happens then? Well, how does it work? It's one thing to say, right, you've embraced an ideology, but to actually get you to do horrible things, what do you need to do? The first piece of this that I can unearth is this notion of sacrifice. That if you sacrifice some part of yourself for the sake of your ideological position, you are going to hold on to its meaning, because you're going to convince yourself that what you had to do was the right thing. Yuval Harari, who's a historian and a philosopher, and he gives an example of Don Quixote. And he talks about the old gentleman in Don Quixote who imagines that he is a knight in shining armor, slaying the ghosts and slaying the people in order to get slaying the dragons and all that goes with that, and slaying the giants. That's it. He's slaying the giants. He says He said, as long as, in Don Quixote, he says, as long as he fought imaginary giants, Don Quixote was just play acting. But once he actually kills somebody, he gives this example. Imagine if he actually did actually kill a real person. Once he actually kills somebody, he will cling to his fantasies for all he is worth, because they are the only thing giving meaning to this terrible crime. Paradoxically, the more sacrifices we make for an imaginary story, so the more sacrifices we make for an ideological position, the stronger the story becomes, because we desperately want to give meaning to these sacrifices and to the sufferings that we have caused. So, for some people, then, when they embrace an ideological position and they do something evil and they do some great harm as a result of it, they are more likely to hold on to their ideological position, because otherwise the harm they did was meaningless. And that's a bridge that's too far to cross for many, many people. I did quite a bit of study on this in terms of IRA killers and the ones that actually went through the process and came out the other end of it, and how some of them actually doubled down. This doubling down, they doubled down on the meaning of it because they had to do this. So for some people, evil doing, ideological evil doing, hardens their positions. They actually become more ideologically hardened the more evil they do, which seems really paradoxical, but it's not. The second psychological piece is, we spoke about Kant in one of our sessions, and the notion of subordinating your will to the moral law. And the difference being that radical evil is when you subordinate the moral law to your will. But ideology is very insidious, because a pernicious ideology actually can replace the moral law. So now you have a new morality. So if we take the Kantian position that human beings are by definition moral creatures, we must have some moral guide. Certain ideological positions replace that morality, give you a new morality. And that morality is what convinces you that when you do something evil, you're actually doing something good. So that's how pernicious it is. It replaces the moral law. So you think about this moral code. And Arendt was very interesting about this, because she says, when she talks about morality, she says, thus, she said, we found that morality actually collapsed on two levels, or twice. She says, hence we must say that we witnessed the total collapse of the moral order, not once, but twice, and this sudden return to normality, contrary to what is often complacently assumed, can only reinforce our doubts. What she means by this is that the Nazis who embraced the ideological, the morality of their Nazi ideology, turned away from it when the war was over. Many of them went back to their original kind of Christian sort of humanistic morality. And Arendt says this should make us more worried, because it just means that morality can shift so easily. So there are many who I would say many Nazis remained convinced in their the ideological zealots. They remained, and Eichmann was one of them. Many of them continued, but most of them didn't. Most of them went back to their normal lives, embraced whatever they thought. Oh God, it was a really bad time. These are the people who murdered people in the East, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of German soldiers who were involved in murdering people. All the administrative staff that were involved in running the Holocaust. They went back to their lives. They thought, oh, yeah, it was the time that was in it. So, this is how ideology can become very, very, very destructive, because it can replace your morality. It uses your conscience. You no longer have to feel. I mean, and this is what I'm saying about Himmler. This wonderful example. He says, we had to do all of that, and yet we remain decent. You just think about that, and look at the world we're in today. Look at what's going on today. Again, I don't want to talk about specific things. I want you to think about this for yourself. Look at what people are doing to each other today. Look at what people are doing when they get up in the morning and they go to work, and that work involves mistreating people and involves destroying people's rights, the and what Iran calls killing the juridical person. That's another element of it. So the sacrifice, once you sacrifice, and then in economics, that's called sunk cost. When you the sunk cost is the cost you can never get back. And gamblers have a huge problem with that, because when people gamble, they try to get the gamble way out of being in debt, and they lose more. Sunk cost is a business concept whereby at a certain point you've got to say, this is a sunk cost, do not put any more in it. However, for people who sacrifice, that oftentimes they're still stuck with that, and they do more of it because they have to establish that what they're doing is actually right. So they've sacrificed something that gives it meaning. They have replaced the morality with their ideological position. Now the next bit is, well, okay, but they still have, you still have your basic human feelings when you see people dying or starving, or you're killing people, or when you're doing all that stuff, you think, well, the next piece of that is, once you start doing it, it gets easier. This is called desensitization. And one of the best examples of desensitization is by Christopher Browning in his book Ordinary Men. The story of the battalion of soldiers, or of order police. They were like traffic wardens. Most of them a bit older, not as well educated as the Nazis, but they were sent to help with the Einsatzgruppen after once Czechoslovakia was invaded, and their job was to help with murdering the Jews. Most of them were family men, and he gives an example. He says the first night when they had to murder the village of Josefrau, and they had a choice whether they could have stepped away. They could have said, no, I'm not doing it, but most of them remained and said, no, we'll do it, because they did it out of camaraderie for each other. The Hamburg Order Police were probably one of the least anti-Semitic cities in Germany at the time. But he says that first night they were sick. Von Trapp, believe it or not, that's the man's name. That was his officer, I think, but it's Von Trapp. Yeah, and he used to go around and give them some drink and tell them this is very, very difficult and this is hard work, and it was awful that they had to do it. And they said okay, and they helped each other and they supported each other. And after that, then they got used to it. And Browning says they made some changes. The people who were appalled and sickened by their first action, that's what they call it, were able to continue the horrible tasks. When time came to kill again, the policemen did not go crazy. Instead, they became increasingly efficient and callous executioners. So desensitization is also a part of evil when you're doing it from an ideological point of view. But it's probably true of any form of evil doing. You get used to it one of the areas where you see desensitization at work when the Greek police were teaching people how to torture people. You had to do your torture class. How do you torture people? Well, when you start off with you're not good at it, your man's people screaming. So what they did was to train them to get used to the screaming first before they actually had any hands-on things. So gradually they reintroduced them. So they were seeing that torture was an important part of your job. So eventually you got used to it. Oftentimes a little bit like getting into a hot bath. It's too hot, so you dip your toe in and you wait until your feet get a bit, acclimatized, and gradually. Well, evil is like that. Seemingly, if you do enough of it, you become immune to its effect. Okay, so that's it for today in relation to ideological evil. This is part 2. There's psychological changes happen inside you. Your morality gets replaced with an ideological position that makes it okay and legitimizes killing people or causing people to suffer, causing harm. You become desensitized by it. As you do it more often, it becomes just a day's work for you. You've replaced your morality. You've made some sacrifice. And the more you do, the more you must believe it's true. And you're then locked in the logic of it. And this is called cognitive dissonance. You have got to square this with yourself. Otherwise, you go mad. And of course, one of the things that's happening in post-traumatic stress disorder is some of the things we think about post-traumatic stress, most of the times we think of people who are frightened and waking up in the night because they were in battle or whatever. That's one strand of post-traumatic stress. There's another strand, which is you became a killer. You murdered people or you did awful things and you have to try and live with yourself now. And that's a difficulty. So cognitive dissonance is the trick that you use to explain to yourself, to harmonize things for yourself. So to summarize, the role of ideology in promoting evil cannot be underestimated in mass evil doing. It provides a cognitive frame that traps individuals both in terms of providing meaning for evil-doing behaviour, permitting them to sacrifice their existing moral ideas by promoting a new morality, and leading them inexorably into greater and greater levels of destruction through a process of gradual, logical steps into destructiveness. Zygmunt Bauman succinctly summarises this when he says, at no point in its long, torturous execution did the Holocaust come into conflict with the principles of rationality. All right, that's session 7. So next session is narcissistic evil. So as you can see, we're putting the strands together that make up the cable of human evil. Somebody may say to me, well, what about demonic evil? And I'll just go back to my first session. There are people, many people, who've a strong belief that there is a form of evil in the world called diabolical evil. And I am not qualified to discuss it, to be very honest with you. So I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm just acknowledging that for some people, that form of evil is more important than any other. However, that's not for me to say. I'm going to stay with human evil, and people who believe in that diabolical evil will say, well, that is human evil because of your demons. Well, I think there's a nice metaphor there, which I'm going to use in the next session, which is called narcissistic evil. And this is an evil that has its own, very much its own identity, and it's very badly understood. Okay, see you in the next session. Bye.